Esche, Stongo, Gary Fife, Joho Jifkidos, Mvskoke Radio, Mabu Hedjitowetskis. Welcome to our program here on a beautiful Okemah morning here. We want to say thanks to all of the folks who've actually listened and let us know how we're doing. I appreciate hearing from you. Sometimes you wonder if there's somebody really out there, but that's good. Anyway, we've got a special guest on our program today, Mr. Mark Trahant, who is a colleague of mine, an old friend, and guy who goes back into business as long as I have, which is about 40 years or so. And we'll be talking to him about national issues and a couple of things that are specific to the Mvskoke Radio, Mvskoke people here. But we want to get an idea of what's going on in, as I laughingly call it, Disneyland on the Potomac. Mark, are you with us there?
I am. Good morning.
Okay, well, it's good to hear you. I was just telling our listeners here about how we grew a few gray hairs together here and there. So.
Exactly.
Yeah. Gosh, how long have you been in the business?
I started a tribal newspaper in 1975.
A year before the centennial, right?
Yeah.
Bicentennial, rather. And, of course, as I like to tease you, I saw you once wearing a Department of Interior name badge, too.
Yep, for a very short period of time. Learned that I'm probably better outside of government.
Yeah. I did that, too, when I worked for a tribal government. I thought, oh, no, I don't want to be making excuses or spins or things like that. Well, anyway, let's get on with it. I've been talking to folks, and they were always asking me what's on the show. And I said I would be speaking with you today about some national issues and a couple of things, and your opinion and point of view on a few others. But let's get on with it. I know your time is valuable. First of all, let's start at the top with the president. Mr. Trump has raised a few eyebrows here and there, and the fur on the back of some people's neck regarding Native issues. And what's your perception there? How does Native America view the president after things like Pocahontas and Andrew Jackson and a few other jabs that have gone out there?
Yeah, he doesn't have, just judging from our readership, certainly the best reputation in any country. And partly it's because his entire focus is on resource extraction. So the tribes that do deal with resource extraction tend to have a working relationship with the Trump administration. But on virtually every other issue, there's certainly been huge challenges ranging from the recognition of tribal lands to spending on infrastructure.
Now, I remember in the years before he was in the White House, he came out very strongly against the expansion of native gambling and said, some of the people who were doing it on the East Coast didn't look like Indians to him, and that there was organized crime involved and things like that, and I believe he used the word rampant. Is that still echoing in the relationships between tribes and the White House?
Well, only in the sense that where there are contentious issues primarily involving land, he's sided come down on the side of the gaming industry. And we now know from former Interior Secretary Ryan Zinke was lobbied heavily by casino interests in the Mashpee land into trust issue, and basically sided with existing casino companies over the tribe and historical precedents. So that came out of this administration without a doubt. This president really hasn't, other than his demeaning references to Pocahontas and his support for Dakota Access Pipeline, hasn't spent a lot of time on Native issues compared to other presidents, virtually none. And so maybe that's a good thing in the sense of actually getting things done.
Right. We don't want him spending too much time finding ways to get in our way. Yeah, as I remember, his casino went bankrupt, and the Indian casino down the road didn't, right?
Right. He's had several that have done that. And I think that's an important piece of context is so much of the president's early encounters with Indians was basically a fight over bookies. Who was going to get to do the deal?
The repercussions near on his land status issue. What does that mean for Indian country if he were given the support and the ability to get what he wants there?
Well, I think in many respects it's been a micro-termination bill, where it's basically taken land that had a historical tie and said if it's not very specific to a 1934 recognition by the BIA prior to that, they can actually terminate the tribe's rights in that particular case. And so I think that's a threat to all of Indian country if they can be so narrow in their ruling of the law rather than looking at the historical precedents of the much larger picture.
And for our listeners who aren't familiar with the phrase termination, that means cutting the relationship, the political relationship between the tribe and the federal government.
Correct. And it was a policy of the United States in the 1950s.
Right. The Menominee tribe comes to mind there, and that was a disaster.
Right. 130 tribes were terminated, and virtually all of the ones that were terminated had economic resources at the beginning of the termination project and ended up destitute by the end of it.
So those who were backing that got what they wanted out of that program.
Yeah. There was a senator from Utah that just hated government, Arthur Watkins, and termination was his personal project, and he would badger tribes and basically blackmail folks with the prospect of per capita and say, if you ever want this again, you've got to terminate. And the tribes that did ended up with virtually nothing.
Right, and a few of them were successful in regaining the status, but most of them aren't around anymore.
Correct.
All right, let's move on to current issues involving economics and money. We know that the president had put up a budget that looked at cutting millions and millions from programs for Native Americans and other programs that our tribal governments have participated in. I think I saw the figure $300 million for the Bureau of Indian Affairs and the Bureau of Indian Education. Now, that was what he had proposed. So what's happening there? What's the status or any action coming up?
Well, the president's budgets in general, not just this president, but in general, don't go very far. They're really just messaging documents about what the administration sees as a priority, because the Constitution gives Congress, not the president, the power of the purse. So Congress decides how much money will be spent. And when Republicans controlled both houses of Congress, there were still better budgets than what was coming out of the administration. And now that is likely to continue with the Democrats writing the budget in the House. The challenge, there's a bigger budget challenge, and focusing on these budget cuts kind of discounts that. And the bigger challenge is that everybody has the votes to say no, but there's really a difficult path to get to a yes. And so one faction, maybe to the Democrats in the House, can say no to a budget they don't like that doesn't spend enough. Republicans who favor defense spending can say no because there's not enough money in that. And getting that consensus built around a yes, which we saw with the government shutdown last time around, is particularly challenging. Where this is going to get tricky is that under the Budget Control Act, which was passed back about 8 years ago, if Congress doesn't come up with a budget that they can agree to, there will be drastic spending cuts through sequestration. And that's actually the biggest danger to Indian country, is that we'll see sequestration again, which was the impact last time was devastating.
Now, a lot of tribes still are very heavily dependent on the federal dollars. Others are not quite as dependent on those monies. In your position there and kind of watchdogging Congress and the administration and what's going on in D.C., what have you seen as feedback from the tribes? Have you had much chance to listen and hear from them?
Yeah, tribes have given a pretty, both through political organizations and independently, tribes have come up with forward proposals on what they would like to see in the budget. And I think they're getting a lot of traction, particularly in the House. It's just a question of whether that then can translate into an operating budget given this environment. But tribes have been very good at getting their word out about what the real needs are in Indian country. Today we have a story about, yesterday, the president and the leaders from Congress met and came up with a deal to spend $2 trillion on infrastructure. And that's really needed. Everyone agrees that it's a requirement. But almost immediately, the minute they left the White House, everyone started to pick apart the deal. And the House Majority, or the Senate Majority Leader, Mitch McConnell, said that they wouldn't touch the tax code to pay for any deal. $2 trillion is a lot of money. And the Democrats, some of them said, well, we want to include climate change spending in this, which the Republicans won't do. So even though they came up with this deal in principle, the fractionated aspect of Washington right now means that it's really unlikely that anything is going to happen other than more gridlock.
The future looks kind of interesting now with the House being controlled by Democrats and, of course, the Republicans in the Senate. What's the atmosphere then for Native issues as they go to Capitol Hill?
Well, this Congress still hasn't passed a Native issue. There's a couple of in the Senate small bills that may pass this very soon. I think on Indian issues, there's actually a lot of consensus that both parties see support for. I think some of the contentious ones that are going to be difficult is to try and come up with a way of moving beyond the party divisions. And I'll give you an example. The Violence Against Women Act, normally when it was first came up, 20 years ago, went through Congress with virtually support from Republicans and Democrats. And there were a few opponents, but not many. It got a little more contentious when it went up again, and it became much more of a party line thing. But Tom Cole brought a lot of Republicans over. And now the issue is very much party lines, and partly because there's a provision in there that allows somebody convicted of a misdemeanor to have their gun taken away. And the NRA opposes that, and they're opposing the bill as a result. And so what that means is for any Republican voting for the bill, they'll get a score that says they're not supporting the NRA that will be reflected in campaign donations and advertisements, and so they're backing away from it on that principle. It's just a really tough environment for people to get across the aisle and work with the other party.
Now, we've had our eyes on the VAWA issue for, since it was in conception. Most of what we heard from our own people here and a little bit from around the country was that VAWA was great, but needed more money and more teeth. Are there moves to alleviate that situation? Are those the bones of contention?
They still are bones of contention. And the way it works in Congress is there are two tracks, and everything has to go through two tracks. The first track is the authorizing legislation, and that's basically what VAWA is. And then the second track is appropriations. And appropriation requires someone to actually spend the money and invest it. And this is a pretty difficult environment for appropriations. Getting it past both houses of Congress is just really tough right now.
Well, while we're looking at Congress, let's get a kind of a more microscopic look. The addition of 2 Native American women in the House is being hailed across Indian America as a wonderful step forward. Deborah Holland, if that pronunciation is correct, and Sharice Davids. They now are in action. They're on important committees and actually have dealt with hearings and things like that. What is their presence now doing to the Congress as far as Native issues go?
Well, both of them have just been superb practitioners of the craft of politics and legislating. Deborah Holland, I think, is moving up in terms of her perception with the party leadership. And the second election is always a tough one, so both of them will have a second election coming up next November. after that, you'll kind of see their path forward. But I would not be at all surprised to see Deborah Holland in party leadership very shortly. She's now chairman of the Native American Caucus. She's chairman of a couple subcommittees. She's used her power very effectively, raising issues at key times. One cool visual for both her and Sharice Davids has been being Speaker Pro Tem of the Congress for the first time ever, and seeing them up there with their gavels. Sharice Davids has got a different approach. Deb Haaland is clearly involved with Native issues all the time. Sharice Davids is there for the votes, but she's been much more focused on her constituency and representing Kansas, and she realizes that that's her main job, and she's really been good at it. The two of them will work together on pieces of legislation, and Deb often will take the public lead, and Sharice will be there for support. But partly that's just because she's from a competitive district, and she is working to make sure that she's not a one-term member of Congress. She's working hard to represent her district.
Now, that is an issue I think it is important to notice there. I remember a comment from former Senator Ben Nighthorse Campbell, who said he's there to represent Colorado, not just Indians. But every tribe that came to town, made it by his office and pled their case. Now, are the two women in the House side then kind of in danger of becoming the Indian Congresswomen?
Well, Deb Haaland a bit, but representing New Mexico gives her a more leeway, so she does have some flexibility there. Sharice Davids has been very careful not to become that, so I think they're both good in that sense. It's interesting. One of the things in some of the treaties, I think including the Creek Treaty, is that Congress was supposed to appoint representatives to Congress. And I've written about this in the past, that there was a provision for delegates. And one of the things that would have done is made it so there would have been a legitimate Native voice in the Congress, the same as Puerto Rico, the same as Washington, D.C., and that's something in the treaties that Congress just never did. And I actually mentioned that to Representative Haaland, saying I would like to see Congress address this again and actually appoint Native delegates to the Congress so there would be an institutional voice in that body.
Yeah, that sounds like it's probably guaranteed to aggravate a few people. Is there a real vocal opposition to Native issues that you're aware of?
Well, there's a growing sense of House Freedom Caucus has been opposed to most Native issues, and it's more about spending and shrinking government than anything else. But for the most part, there's still pretty strong bipartisan support. And one reason for that, frankly, is Representative Tom Cole basically can argue the case inside the Republican caucus. And being that he's a member of leadership, it gives him a lot of weight when he does so. And so a lot of people will listen to his thinking on some of these issues.
That brings up the issue of the Native men, members of tribes that are in there. As you said, Cole and Marqueen Mullen, Cherokee and Chickasaw, I believe. Are they standing up for the cause, so to speak, or are they kind of divided on the issues?
It depends on the issue. Cole definitely is with Deb Haaland on most of the major issues. In fact, they're vice chairs of the Native American Caucus together. And it's hard to understate how significant Cole's role is on most Native issues. For example, again, we talked about VAWA. The Violence Against Women Act never would have become law without Tom Cole. He basically went to the speaker at the time, John Boehner, and said, I'm pushing this. You can oppose it if you want, but this is what we're going to do. And Boehner let him do it. And so that's pretty significant. Marqueen Mullen is a Trump supporter, and it basically, if it's something that the Trump administration is keen on, he will be there. If they're not, he probably won't be. So he wasn't involved. He was against VAWA. One thing he has championed is forward funding for the Indian Health Service, so that if there's another government shutdown, that it won't impact IHS, and that's something that both sides kind of agree on. So it really depends on the issue. I had to laugh today. He had a tweet talking about the danger of socialism and posted that we don't want government funding, government taking over health care. The irony of it is when Republicans talk about socialism, they're talking about communism. And basically, he had a picture in his tweet about Fidel Castro. And when Democrats are talking about socialism, they're talking about Sweden and Norway. And very different ideas about even what is a socialist.
Right. For some people, the Red Menace is still alive and well.
Exactly.
For other people, the Red Menace is us standing up for our rights.
Exactly.
Well, while we're kicking around Capitol Hill there for a second, you've mentioned a couple of issues that have been real important, and of course, what about the wall? I mean, it's just a real point of contention. You mention the thing, and people get riled up real just instantly. And then the realities then are, that wall ain't going to work in many places down there. And one of the places that is opposing it is the Lands and Reservation and Government of the Tohono O'odham. Now, are Indian voices being heard in their concerns about the building of that wall?
I don't think so. In fact, I think that's an area where there's even division among the natives in Congress, is that the Democrats tend to be against the wall in total and bring up the tribal side of the story, whereas the Republicans just support the president. There's a tribal borders caucus, and they've actually come up with a really thoughtful document that looks at some of the issues. It ranges from saying there are people on both sides of the border in our tribal community, and they should be able to go back and forth, to the protection of species, which is becoming a huge issue because if they build a wall, that impacts where herds travel and can feed, and as well as the ability to gather sacred objects on both sides of the border. So the Tribal Border Caucus has actually been very specific about its desires to be included in the conversation. I mean, one of the issues is simple of what languages do the Border Patrol have access to? If they only do Spanish and English, they're missing out on tribal languages that are often spoken by the people trying to cross. So it's been an interesting one that still requires more voice within the federal government. It's interesting, Indian country deals with more borders than pretty much any community because you have the U.S. and Mexico, but you also have the U.S. and Canada. And then I was interviewing some Yupik fishermen in the Bering Sea who got caught on the ice and ended up in Siberia and Russia. So border issues are far more complex for Indian country than almost any other community.
Right. When you were listing those things and mentioned the East Coast, instantly the Mohawks came to mind. They've been going back and forth across that border for decades. I know the Tohono O'odham have family on both sides of that border and still want access to visit them. And Alaska Natives have crossed into Russia more than once, and
right.
Pretty brave souls there. So it's not really taken any concrete form yet. No thing to rally around the flag or anything yet.
Yeah, I mean, the idea of whose border it is, I think, is the basic question, and the 10,000 plus year history of being able to travel where it's important.
Right. I remember reading a book called American Genesis saying, well, I guess those natives did cross the land bridge, but they were going the other direction.
Right.
Okay, well, let's see. Let's get specific here, and you may or may not be following this particular issue. There has been a movement by the Creek freedmen down here in Oklahoma to gain citizenship in the Mvskoke Creek Nation. It's similar to the battle that the Cherokee Nation had some years ago, and I had to deal with that. But now it's taken a legislative form with those groups. The freedmen now having a bill in the House side, H.R. 1514, that I believe has been referred to Natural Resource and the Judiciary, that would sever the relationship between the federal government and the Creek Nation, just completely cut it off. Have you heard anything about that one yet? Any news you can share?
Yeah, not a lot, but I will say this, that the last time this came up, particularly with the Cherokees, the Congressional Black Caucus was the one that promoted the legislation, and they were doing so very publicly. But at the same time, they were still supporting tribes on other issues. So even though they said this was an all-or-nothing deal, in practicality, it was not an all-or-nothing deal. And I think it's going to be similar again, that some of the strongest supporters for tribes in the Congress are the Congressional Black Caucus, and that hasn't changed with this legislation.
What's your thoughts here on this question? Was it a tactical move, you think, by the freedmen to have this issue debated in a court there in D.C., which is predominantly African American, with visibility from the African American Congress members? Did they go there for that reason, do you think? Was it a good move?
I don't know. I mean, really, the resolution at the Cherokee side was from Cherokee, and you would think that it would be the same process that would ultimately resolve it. And with Cherokee, it was so specifically a division between treaty rights versus tribal self-determination that there were two really colliding principles involved. And so that meant there really was no right answer ultimately. But the Cherokees resolved it themselves through their process, and I think anytime a tribe does that, it's always a better situation.
Okay. But any idea of where the status of that bill has? No hearings yet?
Yeah, it's not going to have hearings. It's not going to go anywhere.
Okay, well, that'd be nice. All right. Now let's move on to the issue of consultation. Under President Obama, he set up a very strong and well-received consultation process. The tribes came to D.C. and sat and talked with the key officials and cabinet members, and the president himself made a couple of appearances and vowed to honor the relationship, and kind of on and on and on. But when the current president took office, all of that just kind of went to the trash heap, so to speak.
Right. Consultation is really in trouble across the board. The government, basically, at all levels, not just the federal government, is practicing it with cursory, at best, conversations. It's basically, here's what we're going to do, and it's too late to do it. There's a new GAO report, it's about 2 months ago old, that looks at that and says that with so many of these infrastructure projects, by the time the tribes got it, they had very little ability to influence how the projects were going to run, or how they were going to, where they were going to be built, or what, basically a way to make them better. And that remains a problem. I think it's something the next administration is going to have to take seriously and look at. But it's not just the federal government. At state level, there's a lot of governors that are completely ignoring consultation and going forth with projects that tribes oppose without even talking to them about why.
Right. The DAPL project in North Dakota is still a bone of contention. They're still fighting that battle, and I'm sure there are others around.
Well, Pebble Mine in Alaska is another good example.
Right. Oh, gosh, isn't that a mess? The idea, though, that the government would take our input very seriously just kind of seemed to evaporated. Now, the news coverage I saw of the recent NCAI convention, what was it, in Denver?
No, it was here in Washington.
In D.C.? Okay, good. The representative sent by the White House came in and essentially knew nothing about Native affairs, and then kind of just a show up and show the flag kind of thing. What does that tell Native America? I mean, did you follow that and some ideas on the outcome? I knew it was a mess, and tribes were getting angry too.
Right. My colleague Jordan Bennett-McGay was there, and she did a great story about the issue. The White House basically wanted just to be present and to do a listening session, but they wanted it very carefully scripted, and particularly the Oglala Lakota tribe and its leaders wanted to have a robust forum and discussion, and the White House had wanted none of that. NCAI kind of got in the middle because NCAI was hosting it on behalf of the White House and was trying to keep the White House protocols in place, but the tribes were having none of that, and they wanted to have a much more robust discussion, and so it kind of it blew up on everybody. Right,
I understand. Didn't the Oglalas walk out of that meeting?
They did, and they were not the only ones.
the fallout from that, I think, is something that needs to be noticed too. I mean, relations between the top leadership of the federal government and tribal governments then just looked like it was about to, blow up or dissolve or fall into the aspects of lawsuits and things like that. I mean, are we at that point? Has anything been worked out?
No, I think this is this is a difficult time, and part of the context for that is that as more and more tribes have been investing in their own Washington representation, they've had less and less kind of skin in the game with the National Congress of American Indians and other intertribal organizations. And what that's done is kind of put pressure on some of the tribes that have less resources to use the organizations more, and it's a real thorny issue. It's really a different points of view, but some tribes just have full Washington complements with either hired representation or, in some cases, tribal members representing them here in the city, and kind of that division is playing out in different ways. And also you have a generational shift where, particularly at Lakota, you had a very young chairman who wanted to have results right now versus people who've been in tribal government for a long time, and they see how things evolve over time. And you have that tension back and forth between those two worldviews.
The division there, I think, is something that's important to discuss. I think when you and I began working in this business, most tribes had a chairman or something that I laughingly used to call dinosaurs. They had their relationship and whatever else they had going on the side, and nobody was going to mess with that. And then our younger generation got out of college, and with the backing, feelings, inspiration, excitation by activist movements like the National Indian Youth Council and American Indian Movement and some other smaller groups. And so they were wanting to see something get done, and many times locked horns with the old establishment. Now the younger generation, I think, is gaining control across the nation. So as you see it, has that made a real shift in the tactics the tribes are using going to deal with the feds?
I think there's no concerted strategy right now. They're still resolving that internally. And we both know Chuck Trimble, and Chuck said something really great back in that first wave when young people were taking over, is in the Nixon administration and that whole 1970s era, when tribes were doing one thing and the American Indian Movement was doing something else, it became a great wedge for particularly NCAI in Congress, because they could go to Congress and say, if you don't do this, we'll have to listen to the AIM approach. And Congress would see the tribal path as one that was reasonable and would do it. And now you don't have those two factions working in that same way. It's just still hasn't kind of come to a strategic view yet. But I think it will. I think really the idea that Vine Deloria once said about in every generation someone will rise, and I think you're just kind of the beginning of the cycle for that, where this younger generation is starting to take and hold new reins on power, and it's pushing against an older generation. And there's still not a resolution to who's calling the shots yet. Right.
Still within tribes, there's still a lot of political connections and things still being dealt with. But I think we've seen that other older generations sort of retire or die off because of their age and things like that. I remember once at some conference, I heard a lady, an elder, get up and said, was chewing on this congressman and said, if you don't support this issue, we're going to go out and we're going to go get those aims and come back, and then you'll have to do it.
There you go.
Yeah.
The funny thing is now I'm in that older generation thinking about how do I help the transition for the younger, the sooner the better.
Let me compose myself here a second. We're in that a generation that having to deal with it. I've got a lot more gray hairs now than I used to.
Right.
Now, a couple of times we've talked. You mentioned the role that NCAI is playing, and that organization itself was used to be the rallying point. You can go to NCAI and get your direction or connections or support or whatever else. But in a recent year or two, they've undergone some internal turmoils that really affected their presence outside of D.C. and people wondering what's going on. What have you seen happening there at NCAI? I know they've gotten rid of an attorney, the director retired, and that was over some really nasty issues. But
right.
what's happening with that organization? And let me make a note here. They have a relationship with you and your news organization. Are they still sort of the parent company?
Right. So maybe start with that. Just in the last month, Indian Country Today became a limited liability company, and that company is completely owned by the NCAI Fund, which is the nonprofit version of NCAI. We have a pretty comprehensive memorandum of understanding between the two institutions, and in the next week or two, we'll actually have our own board of directors separate from NCAI. And the board is going to be comprised of 3 members, one of whom I appoint, one of whom NCAI appoints, and one of whom the Native American Journalists Association will appoint. So we'll have that separation. We've been working really hard at separation from NCAI, even though they own us. That said, again, my colleague Jordan Bennett-Begay did a really comprehensive story on the challenges of NCAI with that incident you talked about. And what happened was, a couple of years ago, there was an attorney here who was involved with sexual harassment, and the system in place for dealing with that was not working. And since then, all of the people involved are gone, both the people who were on the victim side and also the perpetrator was fired. And there was a comprehensive study by a law firm looking at how NCAI dealt with these things, and since then they built up a human resource section, and I think they're actually going to hire an HR director to have more of a process in place for that. And so all of that's unfolding very similar to what's going on in all parts of society. It's really not just NCAI, it's the BIA, you can pick any institution and look at some of these same workplace issues and how the institution resolves it. That said, there are structural issues with NCAI that are really deep and complex, and that is how representation works in the 21st century. And the next director is going to have a challenge because you want, again, representing tribes with large land base is very different from some of the smaller tribes. Representing individuals, trying to be this collective Congress is a lot more challenging than it was, say, 40 years ago. In fact, they've actually changed the title. The next leader of NCAI will not be the executive director, but the chief executive, very similar to a company. So that's kind of where they're going with that.
I think the Alaska Native folks could tell you about how that works out.
Right.
When they made their deal on the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act, I was kind of thinking, that doesn't provide for any sovereignty or anything like that. It just makes you a company, and sooner or later that's going to come back to bite you. And I think they've been bitten several times.
Yeah, it's 50 years next year.
Right. Of course, I was around then when that bill with that law came into being. It kind of tells you how old I am.
Well, one of the cool things is, and we're under this major expansion program, and I was in Alaska last week as part of it. And one of the things we're trying to fund is a reporter position up there. And in my pitch to some of the potential foundations, I actually want to have it endowed as a named reporter. So it would be the Tommy Richards endowed reporting for Alaska issues.
Yeah.
Of course, you remember Tommy Richards.
Sure do, yeah. I think that would be a good choice. He was so important in making journalism a fact of life for Alaska Native people up there.
But I want to do it as a way to build this legacy so we all know where we're coming from, that we're standing on shoulders of some really remarkable people.
Right. I'm one of the few people who can actually say I work with Dick LaCourse, the guy you named the award after, or Chuck Trimble and Rose Robinson and Laura Whitstock and folks like that.
All wonderful folks.
Yeah. Gosh, my voice is going nowhere. Oh, let's see if I can speak. No, it's still not. Now, what's the future of NCAI? Have the dust settled now? Are they going to be unhampered as they pursue their activity?
Oh, I think, one of the things that Jordan Bennett Begay looked at when she wrote about was how other national organizations act, and again, thinking through what changes in society. And one of the ways that was reflected in her story was the difference between NCAI and the Alaska Federation of Natives. As you know, AFN is the largest convention in Indian country of all Native people. And one of the reasons it's so successful is that anybody can show up. It's not just high registration fees, expensive hotels. It's something where if you can get to Anchorage or Fairbanks, wherever it's at, you can be in the conference. And that's a model, for example, that might work for NCAI, where it gets away from this really expensive annual conference that only a few tribes can afford, but makes it much more something that's open to all of the people. There are other models out there as well. I think it's going to be the kind of conversation about the future that's going to be really interesting for us to cover because there are lots of options. It's not a one-size-fits-all approach.
Let's shift gears here a little bit. I keep referring to when you and I began in this business. Newspapers were still put out on what's called blue lines.
Right.
Remember those? Yeah, cut and paste, and real cut and paste instead of clicking and clicking. But there were very few of us in business professionally, and not advocacy, but professionally. And now we're at a point where the computer and social media have become a major player in it. You in Indian Country Today just did a national TV special on with the elections and things, and now we're having that capability and the talent, homegrown talent that can pull it off. So analyze our business for me for a minute or two and say where we were and where we've come to today.
Well, this really comes for us. This election was really extraordinary in so many ways, and even before I started this job, I was covering it pretty comprehensively, and then that only picked up when I came to Indian Country Today. And about 6 weeks before the election, realized how historic it was going to be, and not just the members of Congress, but 109 natives running for legislatures and governors and that sort of thing. And so I remember thinking, I want to do something with this, and decided to invest in a national broadcast for election night. And within 5 weeks and for about $50,000, we put together this national broadcast. And to me, that just showed how much talent there is in Indian Country, because we brought together just amazing people in these 5 weeks, and we had more than 40 people working for us that night, and a lot of young people, and they covered the entire country in a way that was just remarkable. And so for me, that kind of set the tone that it's not a problem with talent, it's a problem with the institutions of media not opening their doors. And in my career, and I've worked for a long time, as you mentioned, I've kind of given up on the media ever changing. It's not going to do what it needs to do. And so my path right now is to make sure that we create opportunities for ourselves, and we just ignore the media and do what we're going to do. And that's really kind of my approach going forward to how we change the media, is to develop our own institutions and our own path for making sure this talent has a place to succeed.
Now, we have things like your service there. I remember a couple decades ago, beginning and building National Native News, which is still around and delivering. We have more Native people involved in video production and things like that. So taking all that into consideration, how good of a job are we doing?
We're building. I mean, this is really, I wouldn't say it's perfect. There's a lot of areas where we're really good, and there are really some great stories. High Country News, for example, right now is doing some great stories. We've done some stories I'm really proud of. But we still have ways to go. It's always something you're trying to improve on every time. I just wrote our mission statement for our new board and our memorandum of understanding, and I came across something that Vine Deloria wrote, and that was that it's not that news that's been missing, that Indians have access to news, but he said what we're really badly handicapped is interpreting what events, policies, and personalities really mean. And he said that's where you can get to the idea, because it's the interpretation and the context that will lead to tribes determining our own futures. And to me, that's kind of the mandate for us, is to try to figure out what stories are those that provide that context and intellectual discourse. And the way I put it in our mission statement is our best stories make our readers smart. And that's really what I want to do with the stuff that we can take some time on and do.
Right. Take that activist spirit and deliver it to our people.
Right.
Let me back up a little bit. An item that I noticed on my list I almost forgot. We have finally an Assistant Secretary for Indian Affairs, Tara Sweeney, Alaska Native woman. It took forever to get her confirmed, and now she's in a position of having to address Native America and looks like in some cases deliver some bad news. What's been her performance so far? What has she shown, and what might be her strengths?
Well, I guess on the downside, she's done exactly what she's told.
Yeah, I raised that point in the column once, like here she is supposedly fighting for our people, and she's going to have to tell people the bad news, and how can you do both,
Yeah, they've sent her out for the bad news quite a bit. And, I mean, you mentioned I had an interior badge, and I worked for Forrest Gerard, who I think was, he was the first assistant secretary, and kind of set the bar in a lot of ways. And he always thought this was a dual mission, where your job is to both represent Indian country and the administration, and to try to do both. And some people do it better than others. This is a challenging time for government. And 20 years ago, the BIA was the biggest bulk of government jobs in Indian country, and that's no longer true. The BIA is secondary to tribal governments in most operations. But more than that, even in terms of the federal government, the Indian Health Service now employs far more people than the BIA. What's interesting is we still do not have an assistant secretary or director of the Indian Health Service appointed, let alone confirmed. And we're almost halfway into this administration, so it's a very real possibility that IHS will have an acting director the entire Trump administration.
Would that be Mr. Weaki?
Yeah, Admiral Weaki.
Right. I saw him in some congressional hearings, and I forget, congressman or senator was just tearing him to shreds over the budget and saying...
That would be John Tester.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Yeah, it's like, give me an answer. I ask you a question, give me an answer, and don't repeat the rhetoric. And Miyake kept repeating the rhetoric and just getting beat to heck. We almost slipped there and said something nasty.
Well, you think about the challenges for someone like Tara Sweeney representing the administration, and then you multiply that by a much larger factor for someone who's in a career job who's in an acting capacity. They really have a temporary hold on the position.
Well, that might be advantageous, I guess, to the administration if the people in charge in an acting capacity have less power and protection than a full-fledged assistant secretary. Well, right. Sun Tzu said, keep those people handy, and if they don't perform, cut their heads off and put another one in.
Certainly a possibility.
Well, so much for the Book of War. Let's. I'm losing my voice again. Oh my gosh.
That dry season.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, the allergies are kicking butt down here. A couple of things we've seen happening in the more recent weeks: promotion of a White House task force to protect Indian children, and one on HIV/AIDS that was touring Indian country, so to speak. What do you think about that effort? Is this more window dressing on the set? Is it a PR move, or do you think there will be something concrete coming out of there?
Yeah, I'm optimistic. I think there's something concrete that could come out of it, is particularly when you get into the investigative work, and the committee will have access to a lot of data that not everybody has at their fingertips. Once you get that data, then you can make the case for improved legislation or improved enforcement, and I think that could be valuable, particularly in the child arena. So I don't think it's too early to write it off. It could be something that's very useful.
Could the administration say, well, we did some tribal consultation? Here, look at these two issues.
Well, certainly. I mean, they will. You can just count on it. But again, because this is a long haul, this administration will go away at some point, and a future one will pick up the work. And, this administration particularly has just said we're not going to look at anything in the past. But most of government is not like that. Most government takes these reports and looks at them and uses them as a starting point to see what can be done to be effective. And I suspect the next administration would do that and take a look at the data and say, here's where we can be most aggressive.
All right. Now, a lot of the things we've discussed here so far have been kind of on the downside. But are there any bright spots on the horizon, things that we should be looking forward to?
Well, I really think what we're doing at Indian Country today is a bright spot. And I just think this is, again, I've had a long career, and this is the most exciting thing I've ever been involved with in terms of media, because we have a chance to change the story in a way that is, I think, really significant. Next, in July, we're moving the newsroom to Arizona State University, and we're going to be based on the campus there. We're going to be expanding by about tenfold the number of reporters we hire and producers. And by fall, we're hoping to launch the first ever national news show on public television. And the advantage of a news show as opposed to kind of let's just say a feel-good show would be that we'll deal with issues. We'll talk about the good. We'll talk about the challenges. We'll talk about things that need to be done. And it'll be before a national audience, so people will see the sophistication, the talent, and the aspirations of Indian Country, I think, in a brand new way.
It sounds like our Mvskoke Vision program. It has some of the feel-good stories, obviously, that people want to see, but we've also tackled some of the issues like the budget or corruption in government and things like that, stuff that got us almost canned in the freedom of the press arena. Where we were, as usual, controlled budgetarily and administratively by the tribal government here. And a few years back, we actually got passage of a Freedom of the Press Act and began our mission then. And I think we ruffled some feathers and, the fur on somebody else's back because, just not too long later, there was a movement in our council to rescind it. And they did.
Right.
And then all of a sudden we're thinking, okay, well, what happens? Do the police come in the door and we go out in handcuffs or what? And then we got support in the council to reverse that decision. And then as it passed the council, our tribal chief vetoed the bill and said it was for budgetary reasons and other financial considerations. So we have worked out a deal now, I think a very amicable situation, and have survived, and I think doing a job that we still need to be doing, and I believe our reaction and feedbacks have been pretty good. Now, is this the same kind of situation you see still facing tribal journalism?
Across the country, it's a ongoing back and forth, and a lot of tribes have resolved it. I mean, it really is one, and Richard LaCourse used to talk about being adulthood, where you recognize that the tribal press is not going to write everything you want, and you just deal with it. And the Navajo Nation went through a process to get there. As you mentioned, Mvskoke went through a process to get there, and it's an ongoing back and forth. I think every tribal community, most editors I know, start with the proposition that they work for all the people, not those who just happen to be elected at the time. And that subtle difference makes sure that you're, one, still an advocate for tribes to be around and sovereign, but at the same time you recognize that your job is different than someone who's a political leader.
Right. Okay, well, with that, I think we're going to have to cut it off and wrap this up. Mark Trahan, thank you so much for sharing your perspectives and view and informing us on some of the stuff that's happening there in Disneyland on the Potomac. And yes, I did donate to your program, and looking forward to see what comes out on the other
Sure.
end.
Delighted. Thank you.
All right. Have a good one. We'll talk to you again, I'm sure.
Okay, goodbye.
All right. That was Mark Trahan, who is the force behind Indian Country Today, the new and I think quite effective news service available for Native Americans. Anyway, we've got a few community announcements here to share. Let's see how many we can get through here. First of all, it's Kelly Cup playoffs time, and you don't want to miss the action. The Tulsa Oilers head to the second round of Best of Seven series this Sunday afternoon at the BOK Center. The fast-paced fun starts at 4:05 when the Oilers face off against the Idaho Steelheads. Nothing beats the hard-hitting intensity of playoff hockey. So buy tickets today by phone or text at 918-632-7825 or online at tulsaoilers.com. And don't miss the Kelly Cup playoffs with the Tulsa Oilers this Sunday night at the BOK Center. The National Day of Awareness of Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women Prayer and Honor Walk this Friday at 10 a.m. at the Mvskoke Creek Nation Mound Southside Steps. Wear red. No more stolen sisters. For more information, contact the Family Violence Prevention Program, 732-7979. Okay, Mvskoke Loan Fund is offering its assistance. Grow Oklahoman get to work with new and startup companies. That's May the 3rd at Citizens Bank in Okemah and August the 9th at the College of the Mvskoke Nation. It's free for Oklahoma residents, and seating is limited. So, 918-549-2603. The Holdenville Creek Indian Community Center in Holdenville will be having a May Arts and Crafts on May the 4th. No charge for vendors. Equipment will be provided. Concession available. Contact Augusta, 405-379-3485. That's the May Arts and Crafts Center event in Holdenville. Okay, May 7th is a hiring event. Sofidel is holding its event at the River Spirit Center in Tulsa. Over 150 positions available and on-site interviews. So if you're looking for a job, that might be the place to go. All right, we want to remind everybody that we're calling for graduate profiles for inclusion in the June 1st edition of the Mvskoke News. Now, if you want to get your graduate picture and bio in there, the deadline is May the 10th at 5 p.m. No late profiles will be accepted. They have to get the paper out, and it takes a long time to put it together. Okay, 732-7720. Okay, what else we got here? Celebrate Mother's Day at the Council House. Basket Making with Mom. Saturday, May 11th from noon to 3. I hope to see you there. Let's see, 539-286-4663. I can sneak one more in, I think. 2019 Senior Games, Friday, May the 31st at the Omniplex here in Okemah. So if the seniors want to get out and do battle on the sports field, come check it out, 732-7765. That's it for me. We want to thank you, Mabo Hedgetskut. Mabo Hedgetskut. We'll be back next week with more of it. You've been listening to Mvskoke Radio. Join us again next week for more local, tribal, and community news and updates. Mado.